I'm W.T. Edmondson, and welcome to Focus. Freedom often causes unbelievable silence. Of course, Focus' intent is to inform, educate, and motivate our viewers to action. This is the part 2 of a conversation on race, racism, and white supremacy, and white privilege. We have had a conversation with our guests, and so we're about to go into the second part of this conversation. We have been speaking with Reverend Bo Underwood. He's the pastor of First Christian Church here in Jefferson City. And Brian Keller, he's the editor and president of Word and Way, a Christian publication here in Jefferson City. Again, thank you for accepting the invitation to come and have this important dialogue. I think where we stopped off, we were talking about the church and what goes on inside the church, but not necessarily happening once they go outside the church. So let's pick up there. The conversation on race and racism, white supremacy and white privilege has been elevated disproportionately since President Trump's election. Race and racism, white supremacy, white privilege, all has a dark history in these United States of America. Resolution to this scourge on this society and its inhabitants appear to be an enigma, even to the people of faith. If people of faith who have confessed their belief in the one God, yet haven't adequately come to grips with their individual biases, bigotry, racism, what chance is there for the church, the institutions of faith, to turn away from their inheritance of America's original sin? As Arthur Jim Waller states in his book of the same title, America's Original Sin. Dr. Waller indicated the political and economic problem of race are ultimately rooted in a theological problem. The church has too often baptized us into our racial divisions instead of understanding how our authentic baptism unites us above and beyond our racial identities. Why do you think the church historically condoned and perpetuated racism, sexism, and bigotry all these many years?
And the easy question to Brian.
You know, this is a question I've wrestled with a lot personally in my journey. And the way I've often framed the question is, what went wrong? You know, how did we get from the teachings of Jesus and other prophets and to what we've seen in the churches in the past and today? And I don't know that I have the answers. I've been inspired by the few voices of dissent that pop up from time to time. You know, it was an Anglican priest and a group of Quakers that did the work that resulted in the abolition of slavery in the British Empire. Mm-hmm. You know, while most clergy and people in the pews were supporting it, there were a couple of voices of dissent. Mm-hmm. And even here in the United States, there have been those voices of dissent. And it seems to come down to, there comes to be that moment where they read Scripture seriously, and they see it as relevant for today. One of the individuals that I read and who inspires me and who challenges me because of this exact question is Clarence Jordan. He was a Southern Baptist white minister. In 1942, he and a couple others started Koinonia Farm down in southwest Georgia, interracial farming community. 1942.
Right.
I mean, that's some pretty crazy stuff. Radical. And that's the kind of stuff that got Jesus crucified. Or as Jordan called it, he'd talk about Jesus being lynched, right? And they tried. I mean, eventually in the late 50s, 1957, the year that Gallup poll says that Americans, of course, they at that point were polling white Americans, said it's the happiest year. Those are the good old days, right? 1957. 1957, the interracial community at Koinonia was literally being shot at by semi-automatic weapons, crosses being burned there. Dynamite blowing up buildings, all because they dared to say that whites and blacks should not only be friendly to each other, worship together, even sit down and live and eat together. And this was somebody who took Scripture very literally and very seriously. He had a PhD in New Testament Greek. He translated most of the New Testament before he died into the Cotton Patch Gospel. And that's what I think is part of what we have to do today, is what he was doing was he didn't just translate the words, he translated the context, the time, the geography of the story. So that Jesus was no longer a figure who lived a long time ago in a land far away. He was a preacher in Georgia in the 1950s and 60s. And suddenly it's a whole other story. And Jordan talked about why he did this because, and it was what you said a moment ago, people could hear the stories in church and then walk out and see absolutely no connection to their everyday lives. And so there is no such thing as a Samaritan in the Cotton Patch Gospel, right? Because we don't even know what a Samaritan is other than we know it's supposed to be the good guy, right? And so instead, the racial differences in that story, because the Samaritan was that racial other that was looked down upon. He puts that in a translation in terms that we can understand, so that when that parable is told to a white adult Sunday school teacher asking, who is my neighbor? A white preacher walks by, a white gospel singer walks by, and then a black man comes by, and he's the one that helps. And it helps us to see that the Scriptures are alive and impact our way. They're about today. It's not about some afterlife, it's about today. And I don't know, I think that may be the answer, that we haven't really wrestled with the messages and their relevance. We've done lip service.
So as Jim Wallace, my former boss, has mentioned in his book, as Mark Knoll, who's a white evangelical Christian scholar at Notre Dame, has talked about in relation to the Civil War, these stains run deep in our society. I'm going to kill your ratings, WT, because I'm going to talk about sin.
Okay.
All right? For Christians, sin is that which warps our relationship with God and puts distance between us and God, and it's that which warps our relationship and puts distance between each other. This is clearly a sin. The scourge of racism has put deep divisions between Christians, between churches, and of course between Christians and our God. And just like any other sin, it's a sin we're called to repent from, it's a sin we're called to seek forgiveness from, and it's a sin that often is so tempting we don't even notice it. And I think the real challenge that we now have is that we have this story of progress, and it's a true story. We have made a lot of advances from 1957. But a lot of those advances dealt with the overt racial structures in our society that held certain people down. Now we've got these more covert structures and systems that continue to oppress, continue to create division, continue to be sins, and because they're much harder to see, it becomes a lot easier to say, well, we've made it, we've done it, we've accomplished it all, it doesn't exist anymore. And then you realize, well, when you look at incarceration rates, when you look at wealth disparity over time, when you look at some of these lingering effects of that sin, you realize the sin is still quite pervasive. One of the stories that just breaks my heart is there was a study, a pretty famous study done, where a resume was sent to different firms that were hiring. And the only thing that was different about the resume was the name. And I don't remember what the two names were, but there was one very white-sounding name and one very African-American-sounding name. Those resumes went out, and the number of callbacks that hit to the white resume versus the black resume was, the difference was hugely disproportionate, hugely statistically significant. Race still matters, and it still is a pervasive sin in ways we often don't realize, and once we realize, shock our conscience.
As you were talking, change usually occur because of the action of the few who, for whatever reason, their heart is pricked and they said, wrong is wrong and right is right. And I'm going to step out on faith. Whatever happens, happen. And so, sometime I think we wait and look for the parade instead of the leader of the parade. Yeah. And so I think much too often we place ourselves in a situation, well, something needs to change. Okay, who's going to change it? And God is telling us, I placed it within you to change it. So don't push it off to someone else. My favorite is Esther. If I perish, I perish.
Yeah.
And so the victim mentality says someone else has to perish, not me. And so that's, I think, where we have to move away from, because people of good conscience, people of deep faith, I think they are comfortable and don't want to be the Esther.
Yeah.
And so they know it's wrong, but someone's going to change it.
And to just keep this analogy going, not only are they unwilling to be the Esther, but so often we're the Jonahs, right? Mm-hmm. So often we know what we need to do, we know where God's calling us, we want to do everything we can to run the other way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What do you think, when we talk about racism, why do you think it becomes their problem? Because that's really what we're talking about here, is I know that racism is wrong, but it's their problem. And one reason I wanted to have this conversation, one, as I indicated in our initial piece, I know your character, I know your integrity, and I consider us friends. So I figured that we can have this conversation without any drawbacks. But that is something that has always concerned me. What do you say?
Yeah, I think, and I think there's two ways that we can look at other people and then excuse ourselves from acting. It's easy to look at the crowd that marched in Charlottesville, or to look at David Duke, and to look at very obvious, outspoken voices of white supremacy. As those of us in the white community, it's easy to look at them and be like, well, I'm not that person, right? So I don't, the racism isn't my fault and it's not my problem, right? You can always find somebody worse than you. I mean, I'm sure even David Duke has somebody he can look at and be like, well, at least I'm not that person, I'm not that bad. And so I think that's one way that we look at, say, it's not my problem, it's that person's problem. And then the flip side is looking the other direction. When we hear stuff about, the incarceration rate, or we hear, the predatory lending issues, and and all these things that perhaps I don't personally am affected by, and I don't have a family member who's affected by it. So that's someone else's problem. And maybe it's like, well, okay, I get it, that's a problem, but we're not moved to make a difference. And I think part of that is because we say, well, I'm not the one that caused it. It was the other white supremacists. They're the ones that did this. And so I'm not moved enough to help those that I see on one side, and I'm moved to not act because of those I see on the other side. And I think that's a significant problem that we have to look in the mirror and see, what can I do to make a difference? And it may not be a lot, but it's something. And if each one of us would take that attitude, I think we could see that change.
We live in such an individualistic culture where if it doesn't affect me, it's not my problem, and if it does affect me, then that's all I'm consumed by. And it's my problem to fix if it affects me. And I just think that's such a shallow way of looking at this. Scripture says we're all part of the same body, right? And when one part of the body suffers, the whole body suffers. So if one of my brothers is suffering, that should matter to me. If one of my sisters is hurting, I'm hurting. It's all of our problems, so long as this sin exists, because we're all part of that same body. the church that I was a part of in Chicago, again, African American church on the west side of the city, at the end of each service, we sang the song, I Need You to Survive. I believe it's by Hezekiah Walker, but don't quote me on that. And that song just says, we all need each other to make it through together. I need you, you need me, we're all a part of God's family. Right. And that's the fundamental truth that we have to remember. Because if we get into this individualism where it's a problem over there, as long as it's not affecting me, then I don't have to worry about it. I mean, that doesn't get you very far in the church. Mm-hmm. That doesn't get you very far with Christ. Because that part of the body's suffering, and I'm suffering too, and thus I have a responsibility to do something about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that, we have to come to a point where racism is a serious deal. It's not somebody else's problem. It's not somebody other's issue. There's not one of those things that you can say, well, I'm going to back this person politically or whatever, but I don't accept their racism. I'm voting for them for something else, right? It is bad to vote for a racist because they're racist, mm-hmm. but it's also pretty bad to vote for a racist because racism was not a deal breaker. Mm-hmm. And that's something that we have a serious problem. That it's something, I can excuse that. This it has to become something we cannot excuse mm-hmm. in any form, or we're always going to excuse them as long as they're in power mm-hmm. and helping us individualistically getting our agenda through.
This current situation with Alabama and the election that will be taking place next month, this is serious. Mm-hmm. When you hear people say, well, prove it. Something 40, 50 years ago, it's going to be difficult to prove. But just the fact that you have women who chose to come forward, one, knowing that they were not going to receive roses, so they were going to be denigrated. And so, but they came forward, and you have people making a decision that it's okay to vote for someone who commits such an atrocity against a young girl. And, well, he may be bad, but he's not a Democrat. That something is wrong with politics. And so what that said to me was, I somewhat understand that why far too many Republicans, and it's not really a Democrat or Republican thing, but for the most part Republicans, who can continuously accept that laws are being put on the books to make it harder for black people to vote, for brown people to vote, for poor people to vote, and say it's okay because, well, it's going to reach the end that I want because my person has a better chance of getting elected. Something is wrong with that politic.
Yeah, there's a certain tribalism that has infected our politics right now, where if I'm a Republican and somebody has an R by their name, I don't care who they are, I'm with them. If somebody's a D and has a D by their name and I'm a Democrat, I'm with them no matter what. And the problem is we should all realize is there's good and bad apples in every bunch,
Absolutely.
Right? And so that's really troubling. That's what we've come down to. Now, again, back to this idea of fundamental truths. The fundamental truth of democracy is one person, one vote. The fundamental truth of Christianity is that every person has the image of God inside of them. So there's an overlap there, I think, where what it means to live fully into a democracy and to live fully into our Christian faith go together. We should be standing up for the rights of each person because the rights of each person, a person made in the image of God, matter if we're going to have a democratic society. So this isn't a partisan question. This is a democratic question, and what sort of community are we going to be? And we've got to get away from this tribalism. Otherwise, we're going to be nothing but a fractured country constantly at war with itself.
We've reached a point, and it affects all of our issues, including when we're trying to deal with topics of race and voting rights and so forth, that party ID is the new faith. It's the new religion. 40 years ago, this is some research that a Harvard and a Notre Dame professor have shown that 40 years ago, if your pastor said something that disagreed with your political party, you were more likely to change your politics. That makes sense. Today it's not true. If your pastor says something that disagrees with your chosen political party, you are more likely to change your church. Right? And I give my pastor friends, like Bo, a hard time about this. Say, what's happening here? This is a serious problem because it means the shaper of morality and ethics is no longer the faith community or any other part of our civic community. It's shaped by party ID. That is our new religion.
I fear that is sadly true, and there's another poll out there that shows that not only is what you said true, but that also people don't want to hear from their pastors about politics, which is a problem because you can't read the gospel and not see its public import. Now, the gospel isn't partisan, but the gospel, Jesus doesn't stand up and say this person or this party or that party, but the gospel clearly has public effects and public meanings, and we cannot just privatize the gospel, because if we do, we're not preaching the gospel anymore.
Yeah. The thing here is that did society take it, or did the church give it away?
I think the church gave it away. I think the church, and I think this actually gets to that question that you were asking earlier about why is it that churches, like most other institutions in our society, go along with, condone, and even support and praise slavery. And I think it's the trappings of power. And I think that we saw, particularly in the late 70s and early 80s, this new marriage between Christian faith and a political party. And we started seeing numbers and victories and power. And that's a serious issue for, we're both millennials, and for our generation and younger. That's a serious issue. We're seeing people aren't coming to church, particularly in the white evangelical churches. And part of it is the political marriage. Part of it is the issue of race. And that we're seeing some great progress in our generation and older generations when it comes to perspectives on race. But they're looking at churches and they're looking at other institutions in the society and saying, well, if you're still part of the old system, if you're trying to protect the old way to take us back to those good old days that really weren't that good, then we don't want any part of you. And we've got to find a way. The church has got to reclaim its rightful prophetic space that isn't part of the power game, but is there to challenge authority and to challenge power, particularly any time it does wrong, no matter who it is.
Your question has a weight to it that I'm not sure I can lift up, but let me try it with this. Pastoring a church is a huge privilege. It's an amazing opportunity. I love my job. I pinch myself in the morning that I get to be a shepherd to a people. At the same time, we worship God together 1 hour a week. I get to say a word from the Lord for 15 minutes a week in my tradition. Cable news is on 24/7. Talk radio is there anytime we're in the car. The internet has more information than any of us could ever consume in our lifetimes. I worry that the voice of the church, the voice of the gospel, the witness of Scripture, and certainly the stirrings of preachers get drowned out by all of these other voices that are unfortunately speaking untruths into our lives.
Jennifer Harvey says in her piece, whether in predominantly white churches or in multiracial congregations, it is critically important that collective engagement about race and work for racial justice get specific about whiteness and white identity. When you hear that statement, what does that say to you?
I think there are a couple, we throw some terms around that a lot of us are comfortable with using, white guilt, white privilege. These words are freighted. They have a lot of meaning to them, and they're important concepts for us to understand, but a lot of times there's assumptions made about what that means. And so I think we need to have an honest conversation. What does it mean to be of a certain color of skin, and what are the advantages, and obviously in some situations the disadvantages that come with that? White privilege is not sitting here and saying that the advantage you have because you're white or something you've stolen. It's something you're just given by the fact that you were born a certain way. And we should be honest in understanding what that means and recognizing that, so that when it's operative, we can hopefully be a part of correcting it. So I think that we need to have those honest conversations if we're going to ever get at the root of the problem, which is not that one person or one people think a certain way. It's just that our society is operating by certain rules and norms that have become ingrained, and the only way you can correct them is by being conscious of them and then consciously working to change them and shape them in new ways.
One of the things I appreciate about her work is the idea that we have to even change the way we have this conversation. That too often, and she's speaking as a white Christian, too often we think, well,
White Baptist Christian. No.
Yeah, that's right. We just have to all come together, right? We just need to have reconciliation, which that RE at the beginning of reconciliation is pretty impossible. At best, we can talk about conciliation because we've never actually been there. We can't go back to the status. But that in itself is not enough. That it's not just the fact that we're often separated, whether it be at church times or other places in our community, that we have to actually go back and do the hard work of repairing the breach, of the reparations, of actually undoing a lot of the work that's been built into our society, that's been built into people's souls, into their lives, as we've told them over and over and over that you're not as good, or that, hey, you are better just because of the luck of the lottery on how you were born. That we actually have to do that work. It's not so simple just coming together. And I think that's really important for us to recognize that this is a difficult task, a difficult journey.
One of the things that, as we prepare to close, one of the things that I was intrigued on is when I heard a conversation take place on The Talk, where blacks from childhood have a deeply different experience, emotional, physical, and intellectual, because of the treatment that they receive from the hands of the police that white don't even have to think about. And so where most black parents and other loving adults take it upon themselves to ensure that the talk takes place, not saying that police are bad, but looking at the experience that they've had with the police and saying, I want to keep you from that. And so let me have this conversation with you. It is not who the individual is. It is the fact that he is a police or she is a police. And just by who you are as a black person, your chances of confrontation elevates because of who you are, even from black police officers. So the situation that occurs when that conversation takes place, I can't say, but sometimes listening to conversation, it appears that some white folk don't believe that. But it is a reality. And just looking at what has transpired from the shooting of unarmed black men at the hands of police officers, even with cell phone video, even with police cameras, and the justice system still says, yeah, but. And so when black people see that, they're saying, what difference does it make? And so what parents are telling young folk is, if he's a police officer, while you're talking to him, get his badge number. Come home and tell me, and I will deal with that. Don't you deal with it, because you're just going to create confrontation.
So when I was a child, I had a very different conversation with my parents, right? I remember my mom saying to me, if you ever get lost, we'd ride our bikes around the neighborhood and all that. If you ever get lost, stand at a street corner where there's a street sign and wait for a police car to drive by, flag the cop down, and tell him you're lost. Mm-hmm. I remember that conversation with my mom. The police were seen as rescuers in my community. And obviously, there's a lot of people who have had different conversations with their kids, had experienced in the criminal justice system in different ways. I think some of that is an urban-rural divide. I think it's not all of it, but it's definitely some of it. And then some of it is the systemic stuff that we're talking about. Again, those are so different experiences that part of it is how do we get people to understand and hear and listen to the experiences of others? Because it's only by knowing the reality that each person has faced that we're going to come to realize that what we know as our reality is not the only reality. And that includes, as you mentioned, the reality of police officers. You know, it's amazing listening to some of the stories of police officers about what they see and don't see, what they fear and don't fear, white and black, and the struggles they have in doing their jobs. It's a very, very messy, complex system, and clearly we have not come up with a good way for our society to even have a conversation about this, let alone resolve any of it.
The talk is something that in white communities we also need the talk. But I think more importantly we need to listen and allow our black and brown brothers and sisters and neighbors to come in and give us that talk and actually listen, because we need pastors, we need civic leaders from the white community speaking out, but then also as a community, we need the ones to be listening. We need the listen to the talk, and I think that that's very significant as we come to understand issues.
Yeah. So one of the things I encourage my congregation to do, and a lot of, really when we were working through a lot of this together, was two things. One, as a white Christian, go worship in an African American church. Go experience a different type of church so you realize what that community is talking about. There's just even difference in worship styles. It's just a wonderful experience. Go do that. And I also said, go on a police ride-along and understand the life of a cop, understand their day-to-day experience, ask them questions, understand what they're looking at, so that you can be an advocate in the community for both what needs to change, what is going well, and so you have some actual experience, because so often we are just pontificating about how we see things from our shoes. And I mean, one of the things, again, the internet has allowed us to do is everybody, not only does everybody have an opinion, but everybody now has a way to share their opinion. And we don't take a lot of time to inform ourselves. And one of the things I love about your show and what we're doing here is we're having informed conversations. So I just think we all have an obligation to inform ourselves as much as possible, listening to each other's stories, and then, of course, working for change that creates a more just society.
Yeah, and I agree. With the Black Lives Matters mantra, and then coming behind that, the Blue Lives Matter and the All Lives Matter, and a lot of folks got all tied up in knots, not understanding what was taking place, and created a lot of angst because of that, not understanding the dynamics behind Black Lives Matter. I invite you all to come back again.
Absolutely.
Are you willing to do that?
Anytime.
Okay, let's do that, because I have so many more questions that I need to ask you guys and have this dialogue. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you, WT. Appreciate you.
All righty. Hey, I have been having a tremendous conversation with two friends of mine. Reverend Bo Underwood, he's the pastor of First Christian Church here in Jefferson City, and Brian Keller, he's the editor and president of Word and Way. I hope that you have an opportunity to view these conversations, and not only view these conversations, but have some conversations of your own. Step outside your comfort zone, the boundaries that you have created for yourself. No one creates those boundaries for you. You create those boundaries. Step outside and have a conversation with someone who doesn't look like you, and see what it's all about. Whew. Hey, we'll see you next time. God bless.